Traigo el 1.
1, 2, 3, sí, sí, bueno. 1, 2, 3, micrófono número 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sí, sí. 1, 2, 3, sí, buenas tardes. 1, 2, 3, sí, bueno. 1, 2, 3, sí, sí. Bueno. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Micrófono número 1. 1, 2, 3, sí, sí. Bueno. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sí, sí. Buenas tardes. Esta es la prueba de audio con micrófono número 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sí.
This is Floor Interpretation Booth. This is Floor Interpretation Booth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is Floor Interpretation Booth. This is Floor Interpretation Booth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is Floor Interpretation Booth. This is Floor Interpretation Booth.
Sí, sí. 1, 2, 3, sí, sí. Bueno. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sí, sí. 1, 2, 3, sí. Sí, prueba de audio con micrófono número 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sí, sí, sí. 1, 2, 3, sí. Bueno. 1, 2, 3, sí, sí, sí. Bueno. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. 1, 2, 3, sí. Micrófono número 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sí, sí. 1, 2, 3, sí, sí. Bueno.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can I please ask you to take your seats? We are about to begin this session. Please take your seats. Okay, I now call to order Action Group 6, entitled Global Dimensions. I would like to welcome you all to this. I should also like to acknowledge the presence of the rapporteur of the Action Group, Mr. Issoufou Oumarou, Deputy Secretary General in the Ministry of the Interior in the Niger. I would also like to give a short, like my colleague from the Secretary, to brief you shortly about how to ask for the floor. Siad, please, can you tell them?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Distinguished delegates and participants, in order to request the floor, please press the microphone button. And when the floor is open during the interactive segment, you will be given the floor and you should not press your button again because that will take you off of the list. So please press the button to request the floor and then the microphone will automatically be turned on when you are given the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. In the concept note for this session, the co-facilitators have established that the GCM is an opportunity to improve international cooperation to facilitate safe, orderly and regular migration. This is crucial since the realization that no country can effectively manage migration alone, whether to reap its benefits or address its challenges, has motivated us to engage in this exercise. As often stated in the thematic consultations, the Global Compact on Migrations is not an exercise to develop new norms, but rather to agree on a framework for action based on existing normative frameworks. As we pursue this, we should seek forms of cooperation that leads to more effective implementation of norms, principles, and common objectives that member states have committed to. Numerous interesting recommendations for cooperation at the global level have come up during the consultations. For example, to enhance the capacities of consular services and migrant support centers along key migration corridors, and a multi-agency support function to facilitate the negotiations, implementation, and follow-up of bilateral and regional agreements on mobility. Together, such mechanisms could contribute to protecting the human rights of migrants and enhance their protection, facilitate movements of migrant workers, address irregular migration, and enhance development effects of migration. Equally important is to consider the role of the UN system in improving international cooperation on migration. The progress made over the last decade or so should give us hope that it could play a crucial role in this regard. We have seen the recurring high-level dialogues on international migration and development, constructive exchanges of experiences in the Global Forum on Migration and Development, and the inclusion of migration in the 2030 Agenda. Last year pushed the advances even further. IOM finally joined the UN system, and the New York Declaration saw commitments to develop this compact on migration and the one on refugees. Together, these advances indeed present a unique opportunity to improve the global cooperation on international migration. We need to keep in mind, however, the proliferation of migration issues across the UN system. Without a clear coordination leadership, this will be less effective. This was highlighted in the Doyle report, it was highlighted in the report by the Global Commission on International Migration, and most recently it was highlighted in the Sutherland report. Through the GCM, we have had the opportunity to signal through the GCM, we have the opportunity to signal that with IOM's entry into the UN system, member states would like to see greater system-wide coherence on migration, more effective cooperation globally, and a country-level system, country level, a more effective support to member states and to migrants. A key question in this regard will be how the UN system is geared up to support the follow-up of the GCM and what role IOM and the other organizations may be given in this regard, taking into consideration the comparative advantages of each and every one of those. This brings me to the guiding questions for this session, and I ask you to be as concrete as possible in your contribution. 1, what are your national priorities under this dimension? 2, what actionable commitments would you like to see included in the Global Compact relating to this dimension? 3, what means of implementation do you foresee for above actionable commitments? And 4, what partnerships will be necessary for the implementation? And before I open the floor, I will just remind you that you are supposed to keep your interventions at a maximum of 2 minutes. I will cut you short if you go over 2 minutes, sorry, but I want as many delegations as possible to be able to take the floor. So, thank you. So first on my speaker list is Zambia, followed by Ireland, Bulgaria, the European Union, and Canada. Zambia, please, the floor is yours.
Chair, could I be given another chance? I organize myself. My delegation is very small.
Okay, we come back to you. So the next one would be the EU, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the EU and its member states. And as you just mentioned in your introduction, I think we all agree that migration is a global phenomenon that demands global responses. And therefore, in our view, the future Global Compact should build on and reinforce the principles of solidarity and shared responsibility. I think this is the basis for our discussion here. We need a more effective multilateralism in line with national competencies. We need closer international cooperation around actionable commitments, and therefore we suggest 9 points where we should focus this international cooperation on. First of all, we need international cooperation in order to harness the positive contribution of migrants to inclusive growth and sustainable development. Second, we need it in order to address the drivers of irregular migration through an integrated approach to conflict, crisis, and sustaining peace, as well as taking also into account the effects of climate change. Third, we need more international cooperation in order to strengthen international measures to combat smuggling of migrants, paying particular attention to migrants in vulnerable situations, and also address trafficking in human beings. In this regard, the future Global Compact should call for the universal ratification and full implementation of the protocol against the smuggling of migrants and the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. My fourth point is we need international cooperation in order to effectively strengthen border management, as well as return and readmission in accordance with the obligation of all states to readmit its own nationals. Fifth point is we need it in order to ensure the protection of human rights of all migrants, regardless of their status, in order to promote reintegration programs, in order to enhance development of the countries of origin. Seventh point is we need cooperation also on this global dimension in order to support fair and ethical international recruitment and migrant workers. The eighth point is we need it in order to improve disaggregated data collection and foster knowledge exchange. The EU and its member states already contribute to strengthening the international cooperation under the 2015 Valletta Summit follow-up, as well as the partnership framework on migration. Through this framework, and I think this is a good example, the EU is pursuing...
I'm sorry, I think your time is running up now.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just make my last point. I think we also need to streamline international governance, and for that we see a leading role for IOM. Thank you.
Thank you. The next one on the speakers list is Ireland, followed by Bulgaria and Canada. Ireland, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Ireland, of course, aligns itself with the statement, or, well, we don't deliver statements, not statements delivered by the European Union, and we'd just like to add some additional remarks on our national capacity. Within the global governance, or within the global dimension of migration, we are very closely working to align very closely with the implementation of Agenda 2030. For us, the express references to migration in Agenda 2030 really were a sea change. It's been, the migration has been around the margins of the United Nations for quite some time, but Agenda 2030 was the first time that it really was fully acknowledged and recognised in the UN context. And it's really important for us that any follow-up and review mechanism emerging from the Global Compact on Migration dovetails in the best possible way with the follow-up and review for the SDGs. We're looking ourselves at how we'll integrate the migration dimension into our voluntary national review that we will be presenting next year. One final point in relation to the gaps that we have here on data is a really important issue. We are committed to leaving nobody behind, and in particular, Ireland has a particular attachment to the conclusion of that phrase, which goes to reach the furthest behind first. And I think many of us know that migrants in vulnerable situations are certainly those in the furthest behind. Our big challenge is we actually don't know who they are. We don't have enough international cooperation to ensure accurate data on migrants and disaggregation of that data when we have it, looking at reasons why they are leaving, whether that's development, whether it's climate change, whether it's economic opportunity, and we fully support anything that the Global Compact can do to increase international cooperation to improve data capacity in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ireland, and thank you also for specially mentioning data collection. This is, of course, a very important issue. The next one on the speakers list is Bulgaria. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Bulgaria aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union, and allow me now to outline some specific points in my national capacity. It is our conviction that the international community should emphasize on global responsibility sharing. And we should be aiming at seeking a balance in the development, migration, and security nexus, including by addressing the root causes of migration through engaging more countries to cooperate. We should focus on youth and ensuring its access to education and healthcare. The protection of human rights of migrants is our highest priority. It requires coordinated action-based approach on the understanding that addressing human rights of all migrants, regardless of their status, is a shared responsibility of countries of origin, transit, and destination. Along these lines, we believe that the Global Compact should reflect the importance of a developing border control cooperation, for instance, through regional strategies on integrated border management, on countering migrant smuggling and trafficking of human beings. Sustainable long-term solutions can only be achieved through joint efforts in a spirit of understanding among all parties. My country is attaching particular emphasis on the international governance of migration, including through effective cooperation on return and readmission. And Mr. Moderator, in concluding, let me assure you and the audience of my country's readiness to keep migration high on the agenda, since it is one of our highest priorities of next year's Bulgarian presidency of the Council of the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bulgaria, and thank you for informing us about your priorities for the presidency, and of course, every success with that. Thank you. Next one on the speakers list is Canada. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and I will put my comments into the 4 questions you have very helpfully put forward. So first, in terms of priorities, for Canada, the Global Compact for Migration must become the principal instrument for migration governance. It should advance progress toward the migration-related SDGs and the New York Declaration commitments, and should also build on existing migration-related instruments. The Compact should present a long-term, coherent vision of global migration and outline concrete, practical actions to achieve this vision. In terms of commitments, where states may diverge in their views on how to address some issues, that is, where there is no clear way forward in the compact, Canada would recommend that there be a commitment to use existing international forums to pursue further dialogue. In terms of implementation and partnerships, the current global migration architecture includes many actors who work on migration issues. Just as we support a whole-of-government approach in national migration systems for policy coherence and coordination, the compact should identify one body within the UN system responsible for coordinating organizations and processes that work on migration, particularly ensuring they contribute in a coherent and coordinated way to Global Compact implementation. As per input to the SG's report, which you may find publicly online, Canada believes the IOM should have this role. It is a lead migration organization and the new UN Migration Agency. It has the necessary experience, migration policy and technical expertise, and a broad global footprint. The IOM should work in close partnership with other members of the UN family, including the ILO, OHCHR, UNHCR, UNDESA, WHO, World Bank, to name a few, as well as regional organizations and multilateral bodies. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Canada, for reminding us of the usefulness of coordination both at the UN level but also at the national level. Next on my speakers list is Denmark, followed by Cabo Verde and Jordan. Denmark, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to associate myself with the statement made by the EU earlier on. I think the last couple of days have clearly underlined that our point of departure for the work ahead is very strong. Also because we already have frameworks for human rights norms and obligations needed at hand. So in our view, the process for the global compact for safe, orderly and regular migration should therefore not lead to further legally binding instruments, but should focus on, we need a lot more of implementation of existing rules and standards. We are looking at the global dimension here, and we also talked a lot about coherent policies, and I would like just to one example, Denmark's new strategy for development cooperation and humanitarian action. We are placing migration at the very forefront of our development cooperation, working actively to support our partner countries in addressing the root causes of irregular migration. Close partnerships with national governments, civil society and the private sector. Migration aspects are systematically integrated into relevant country programs and designed in a flexible manner, taking into account the different country situations and ensuring that the targeted efforts to promote sustainable development in countries of a region. Another example, climate change. We know it can be a driver of irregular migration, acceleration, accelerating instability and deteriorating living conditions. As one example of our bilateral cooperation, which I think we could broaden out in a more global way, Denmark is working in partnership with the government of Ethiopia to promote food security during a drought and a more sustainable use of natural resources, promoting resilience. So these are some of the examples that we would like to share. And then I would also like to say that in our work on the compact, we should address both focus on the drivers of migration, as has been said, regular migration, and also irregular migration. In that respect, I would also associate myself with those who have called for focus on that we need the data, and we should work on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Denmark, and thank you for those concrete examples. Next on the speakers list is Cabo Verde. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The national priority of Cabo Verde pledge for the global recognition of the main drivers for migration, consequently on the need for an holistic response and a political governance of the migration phenomena, based on international cooperation in the context of multilateral system in which the United Nations plays a central role of converging member state views. We commit ourselves to promote and protect migrants everywhere at any time in the fulfillment of their human rights, including readmission agreements by which migrants are not criminalized just because they are undocumented migrants. B, intensify our international cooperation on migration and to strengthening the mutual link between the migration impact and the SDGs' effective implementation. Work out possible measures to overcome or mitigate root causes such poverty, of climate change, drought and desertification, natural disasters, armed conflicts, and political instability. In brief, the absence of sustaining peace and sustainable development. We propose to implement those commitments by way of partnership to strengthening our national capacity in migration governance by an effective implementation of our national strategies with regard to migration, and searching and mobilizing ways and means of implementation, both national and international. Since my country has been a country of destination at its inception, became a country of origin, and now facing both situations, we strongly support the conclusion and the adoption of a global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Cabo Verde, and thank you also for pointing at countries being both countries of destination and origin at the same time. Now on my speakers list is Jordan, followed by IFAD, Council of Global Unions, and then Germany. Jordan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Most of the points I would like to mention has been mentioned by the European Union representative, which I do support. Just I wanted to add a couple of points. The importance of the notion responsibility sharing in dealing with the migration and refugees issues in parallel, and the need for balanced approaches and visions in this regard. And it's essential for the international community to focus on the long-term developmental assistance while addressing the drivers and routes of migrations. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Jordan. Next one on the speakers list is IFAD. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the reality of 1 billion people who either send and receive remittances, and the target 10C of the SDGs to reduce the cost of remittances, we would like to provide the recommendations that were set during the celebration of the International Day of Family Remittances 2016 and the Global Forum on Remittance Investment and Development in New York, organized by IFAD, DESA, and the World Bank. The 4 points would be improved data. It is necessary to improve data on remittances to foster effective policies and private sector engagement and investment. Number 2, supporting an enabling environment that promotes greater market efficiency and addresses major regulatory issues that continue to challenge the remittances industry. And I would like to name a few on that. Taxation of remittances, money transfer account closures, or so-called de-risking practices, as well as exclusivity agreements. And we'd like to know that all these incentives, informal transfers, incentivize informal transfer systems, lowers competition, increase costs, and threatens the ability of migrant workers to send money home to their families. On number 3, leveraging the impact of remittances through financial inclusion and diaspora investment, which are our major aspects that can significantly contribute to the development communities of origin. And finally, on number 4, promote global partnership and campaigns at the local, national, regional, and international levels among the public and private sector society are also highly recommended. And one example of this that I would like to share is this year's celebration of the International Day of Family Remittances that was endorsed particularly among the private sectors, which waive the cost or the fees of remittances during that day. And we believe that this could be something that have a tremendous impact in migrant remittances and investment and in reaching the SDGs. We look forward to working with member states and stakeholders to support the Global Compact on Migration. Thank you.
Thank you, IFAD, and thank you for pointing to the important role of remittances. Next on the speakers list is Council of Global Union. Please, the floor is yours. I think the microphone is going to be fixed now.
Not really. Hello, it's working now. Thank you. I represent the Solidarity Center, a labor rights NGO aligned with the international trade union movement through the Council of Global Unions. On the topic of our session today, we have 3 main points. First, we would like to see recognition in the Global Compact of current processes and standards. Instead of reinventing the wheel, we would like to see the Global Compact incorporate important processes that are already in place that just need to be enhanced and supported to work well. For example, related to labor migration, we would like to see incorporation of all of the ILO core labor standards and the ILO's tripartite process brought into the Global Compact, recognized in the Global Compact, and recognition of the ILO as the lead agency on labor migration in the UN system. Secondly, it's been very heartening to hear the states talk about human and labor rights, but we would like to move beyond talking about it to action. Regardless of whether a worker is a national worker, a migrant, a refugee, we believe strongly that they all should have the full ability to exercise their labor rights, especially the freedom of association, right to organize unions, and collective bargaining. If we want this Global Compact to work, workers need to be given full agency and representation. We also think that there should be, in terms of monitoring and implementation of the Global Compact, a joint UN agency approach where the best use of the distinct but complementary processes and expertise of the different UN agencies are brought to bear. Finally, in terms of looking at this issue of labor migration globally, and there's a lot of discussion about sustainable development, we want to stress that sustainable development is not just about remittances. We must look at the social dimensions and impact of labor migration and the long-term impact on families. We're creating, through temporary migration programs and other systems, segregation of low-wage workers into sectors where they're not able to exercise their political rights, their worker rights, and where they're being separated by their families. We need to think about development in a different way, that it's not just about remittances, but also about all people, regardless of whether they're low-wage workers or otherwise, to exercise their rights. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next one on the speakers list is Germany, followed by Japan, Azerbaijan, and United Arab Emirates. Please, Germany, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to emphasize that Germany aligns itself with the EU statements. I want to give you a quick overview about over 4 main priorities of Germany. First, addressing drivers of migration. We should fight inequality as a driver of migration by effectively implementing the 2030 Agenda and the Agenda for Humanity. Second, reducing irregular migration. We should fully inform migrants about legal options to migrate and about the risks of irregular migrations by, for example, establishing counseling centers in countries of origin. Moreover, we should exterminate trafficking in persons, smuggling activities, and the related false information by, for example, cooperating in awareness-raising campaigns. Third priority, strengthening regular pathways of migration and enhancing cooperation on returns. We should provide information on employment opportunities in countries of destination for potential labor migrants by, for example, informing on professional qualifications required, pathways to achieve them, and entry and residence requirements. We should cooperate effectively towards facilitating the return of states' nationals who do not have the legal right to stay by, for example, swift identification and issuance of travel documents through the consular services of countries of origin, as well as by supporting civil registry systems enhancement and digitalization in countries of origin. Fourth priority, fostering international cooperation and migration governance. We should build frameworks for close cooperation between countries of origin, transit, and destination. Other measures to be considered should be a strengthened international border management cooperation through joint training, information campaigns, and the exchange of best practices. Last but not least, the collection of disaggregated data on the basis of international agreements in order to assess effectively challenges and opportunities of international migration is central in this context. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for those concrete proposals. Now it's Japan, followed by Azerbaijan. Japan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. So, as for global dimension on migration, so we have two priorities. Our first priority is to address the root causes of forced migration and to ensure humanitarian and development nexus in order to address such root causes. There are many drivers of forced migration, such as conflicts, extreme poverty, climate change, and disaster. In order to address such root causes, development assistance has an important role. It should be delivered in addition to humanitarian assistance. From this point of view, Japan believes the concept of humanitarian and development nexus be reflected in GCM. Our second priority is to promote the capacity building of migrants in the country of destination. The migrants empowered in the country of destination are expected to contribute to the economy and society of their country of origin when they return to home country. In Japan, we have technical intern training program by which low-skilled workers of developing countries are accepted as trainees. This program is also intended to contribute to human resource development of people in developing countries. We believe that such policy, which is a win-win for both countries of origin and destination, be promoted and reflected in GCM. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Japan. Next on the speakers list is Azerbaijan, followed by United Arab Emirates, and then Zambia. You will have the floor. So please, Azerbaijan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Mr. Moderator, let me briefly to present our remarks in terms of our national priorities. The specific issue that we would like to see in the Global Compact on Migration relates to internal displaced persons. In our view, references to IDPs need to be included to the text of the Compact, and the rationale behind this assessment is as follows. New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants highlight that there are over 40 million IDPs worldwide. In its paragraph 20, this declaration specifically and exclusively talks about the IDPs, among others recognizing the possibility that IDPs might seek protection and assistance in other countries as refugees or migrants. In the light of the above mentioned, we believe references to IDPs could further strengthen the Global Compact, and I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much, Azerbaijan. Next one is United Arab Emirates. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Chair. The UAE would like to propose for inclusion in the Global Compact for Migration two specific actionable commitments. The first is to increase the availability of financing for victims of natural disasters. Natural disasters becoming increasingly important drivers of migration. The early availability of finance, especially before a disaster strikes, can be an important factor in preventing migration that is not voluntary from happening in the first place. Means of implementation include the incorporation of instruments such as forecast-based financing and disaster risk insurance mechanisms into national disaster preparedness strategies. Partnerships necessary for implementation would need to include governments, development agencies, international financial institutions, as well as stakeholders, including civil society and the private sector. The second is to reduce to 3% the transaction cost of migrant remittances as per SDG 10C. Means of implementation could include the review of regulations and licensing of payment service providers with a view to promoting financial inclusion and encourage competitive costs. Regulations should encourage competition among service providers to create an environment that is conducive to faster, cheaper, and safer transfer of remittances. Partners for implementation would need to include governments, notably central banks, and other regulating authorities of service providers, as well as the private sector. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and thank you for those concrete proposals. Next one is Zambia, followed by Eritrea and Tuvalu. Zambia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, for your understanding. Apart from looking forward to a global compact for migration being inclusive and comprehensive, we are looking forward to something that should be based on a shared responsibility in the spirit of international cooperation and governance through partnership. We would like to see the Global Compact placing emphasis on the protection of rights of migrants regardless of their status. This will entail strengthening protection mechanism, especially for those most vulnerable, the women and children. In terms of inclusion, we would like to see a GCM that will afford provisions to facilitate for socio-economic integration of migrants into host communities with the support of the international community by guaranteeing migrants access to services. In Zambia, we have done this in the area of refugees, and we feel it can be replicated with migrants. We also look forward to a GCM that will enable addressing the root causes of or drivers of migration, including adverse effects of climate change. And with regard to climate change, we would like to add the following, that for the implementation of the Global Compact, innovative measures to encourage effective and sustainable management of natural assets is necessary to provide alternatives to distressed migration. The amount of productive land lost every year, combined with an unprecedented number of youths entering in the job market, suggests that a safe, orderly, and regular migration will be hard to reach unless there is a significant and coordinated action that addresses youth employment and the integration of vulnerable individuals. Land rehabilitation and sustainable land management are but some of the measures that can reduce the adverse factors that motivate people to move out of necessity in unsafe, often desperate and dangerous conditions. I can also share this with a meeting here that for Zambia, we have launched a tree-based economy with
I'm afraid your time is up.
hectares, aforementioned targeted afforestation target, and the creation of 3,000 jobs. Chair, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Zambia, and thank you for pointing to the usefulness of partnership. Next one on the speakers list is Eritrea. Please, the floor is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Eritrea believes that the Global Compact for Migration could contribute in the better international management of migration and ensuring that migration is an important aspect in implementing internationally agreed development agendas. It should recognize and develop ways to enhance migrant contributions. In this regard, the GCM could focus on the following areas to enhance the contribution of migrants for the development of the developing countries. The first one is linking migration with the Agenda 2030, more specifically on targets related to the economic growth and development of the developing countries. This can be done through the informed international cooperation to harness the capital and social investment of migrants to least developing countries by addressing the institutional barriers to diaspora engagement, including business regulations. Another one is promoting interinstitutional network and twinning programs between private sector and educational institutions in the countries of origin and destination in order to enable migrant communities to contribute to their country of origin. Additionally, extending with bilateral or multilateral frameworks, concessional credit facilities to migrants who desire to invest in their countries of origin. Secondly, the GCM can focus on reducing the cost of remittance transfer to developing countries, especially to Africa, to 3%. This can be done by increasing remittance transfer through regular channels, by assisting African countries through the transfer of appropriate and affordable technology for the use of cross-border mobile financial services, by harmonizing to an extent possible regulatory requirements related to international and national regulation on anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism, introducing innovative means and disseminating information to encourage remittance transfer through formal channels. Finally, we believe that all of these mentioned can be implemented through partnerships between countries of origin, destination, international financial institutions, as well as private sector as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Eritrea, and thank you also for mentioning the important role of the private sector. Next on the speakers list is Costa Rica, followed by the World Bank Group and Special Rapporteur on extrajudiciary executions. Sorry. So now Costa Rica, the floor is yours.
Many thanks indeed, Mr. Chairman. We do believe that it's very important to say that Costa Rica is a very small country in a Latin American region, which itself is small. And we have neighboring countries, of course, that are countries of origin, but Costa Rica is a country of destination and now a country of transit, and in light of the above, the issue of migration and receiving immigrants into our country has always been an issue of concern as part of our national legislation and national policies. We've always focused on that issue when formulating laws and policies. But talking about migration here, well, at the end of 2016, we noted that things had changed. In under 12 months, more than 25,000 people had moved through our country. 80% of these were from Africa and Southern Asia. That was in 1 year. Despite its migratory dynamics, Costa Rica has also had harnessed a great deal of experience for migration at a local, regional, national and international level, and in light of all the experience, Costa Rica believes that there needs to be a more global focus on migration given the new nationalities that are emigrating and immigrating and given the new trends that are coming to the fore. Our national priorities have been to closely monitor new migratory tendencies, and we've aligned our regulations to ensure that they're consistent with these trends so that we're able to respond effectively to these new trends as they emerge. We always prioritize real and effective regularization, particularly of labor migration and the migrant women in particular, as well as indigenous migrant workers. In September 2016, the New York Declaration, in our view, was a very important step forward because it will guide our work at a time when we most need guidance in terms of the global approach we will adopt to migration. We are unstintingly committed to all the contents of the New York Declaration. We've strengthened our own migration policies in the light of that declaration to ensure that they are consistent with it and consistent with new migratory flows. We've strengthened our work against human trafficking and the smuggling of migrants. But we have major challenges still to overcome. Thank you.
Costa Rica. The next one on the speakers list is the World Bank Group. Please, the floor.
Good afternoon. This is Sonia Plaza from the World Bank, representing the GMG.
Sorry.
Sonia Plaza from the World Bank. Sonia Plaza from the World Bank, representing the GMG and talking about the diaspora. I wanted to mention three things. The contributions of the migrant diaspora communities are increasingly recognized as they fill important gaps in labor markets, transfer large amounts of remittances, and contribute to innovation, entrepreneurship, promote trade and investment, as well as through the transfer of technology, skills, and knowledge. We have had the discussion in the morning on different contributions of the private sector, but we would like to work a little bit more with the governments, how diaspora communities can be both a direct source of investment for trade, for technology, but not only on the countries on the north, but also in the south. The diaspora contributes not only the skilled migrants or the skilled diaspora, but also the lowest skilled diaspora contributes to development in the south and in the north. Diaspora members can act as a catalyst for the development of capital markets. In this regards, I wanted to provide 4 concrete recommendations that it should be included in the Global Compact on Migration. First one, simplifying the AML, anti-money laundering, and counter-terrorist regulations for low, small transactions. The risking will not facilitate mobilizing remittances and diaspora resources. This is important for all the countries, and the risking is impeding a lot the investments by the diaspora and also trade operations at this moment. It's not only impacting remittances, but trade and investment. We need to improve data. Nobody knows where the diaspora is. We don't have data on the diaspora, and even some of the censuses that we are collecting data on migrants, we don't know where the person has been born or where the parents. So we don't have a complete estimate on the diaspora. Means of implementation, we can work with the statistical office and we can partner with all the governments that are saying that data is important. Third recommendation, improve diaspora outreach. This is the responsibility of the own governments, embassies, foreign service departments.
I'm afraid you have to wrap
more
up
information,
now.
investment, trade, and investment. Then finally, we can use the example of development and access to capital markets. For example, Nigeria just issued a diaspora bond. So that could be one way that we can fund some of the investment and industrialize Africa, tap into the diaspora for technology, trade, and investment. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those concrete proposals and also highlighting the importance of the diaspora. Next one on my speakers list is the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudiciary Executions, followed by China and Colombia. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking today to make a call for a global response and international cooperation to address the mass casualties that characterize migrations. I will suggest that at least three areas of international cooperation are required. The first one is to combat impunity for the killings of migrants. I've heard many speakers talk about combating smuggling, and allow me to make a plea that what needs to be combated as a priority is smuggling with homicide or smuggling with the torture of migrants. At the moment, there are very few cases that are being brought to justice. Secondly, we need international cooperation to identify the dead and missing and to trace them back to their family. And thirdly, we need far better cooperation and effective mechanisms to count the missing and the dead. IOM is leading on this project and of missing migrants, and there is no doubt that more resources is required. With regard to the investigations, I think far more can be done to prioritize the investigation into the so-called aggravated smuggling with the cooperation of UNODC, Interpol, Europol, and the development of appropriate collaboration across countries of origin, transit, and destinations. The work on the identification of the dead and the tracing to the family is currently done at a very small scale, mostly by NGOs and universities. We need far greater international cooperations and resources so that post-mortem and ante-mortem information on the dead can be traced back to families who live in great anguish, waiting for news about their missing relatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next one on the speakers list is China, followed by Colombia. China, please, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, China agrees with you that the GCM should not set up new norms or policies on migration. Instead, we need to develop actionable framework on how to implement the current consensus and the policy and the norms. Second, we believe that this national sovereignty and the international cooperation are not contradictory. The GCM should balance the relationship between national sovereignty and international cooperation, taking into full account the different national realities and the levels of development of member states. In this respect, we encourage member states to facilitate regular cross-border movement by reducing visa barriers and customs clearing obstacles through bilateral agreements. International cooperation, international coordination, and intelligence sharing also need to be strengthened to prevent and combat illegal migration, human trafficking, and smuggling. Third, we believe that the GCM should mainstream a development perspective in order to address the root causes or drivers of migration. In this regard, we call for the developed countries to honor the commitment to deliver development assistance and technology transfer to the developing countries in order for them to fully implement the 2030 agenda and to address the poverty, climate change, and natural disaster challenges. Fourth, regarding the follow-up mechanism, China is in the view that the Global Compact is not a legally binding document. Its implementation should be on a voluntary basis. The GCM should avoid setting up indicators or criteria for member states to implement this document. The UN agencies have different mandates on different aspects of migration. The follow-up mechanism should avoid duplication of work or undermining the mandates of different UN agencies.
I will ask to have to wrap up.
As the UN is already restrained regarding its mandate, the GCM should not consume too much resources. We suggest that the UN General Assembly to assess the progress of implementation of the GCM in a regular or irregular basis. We do not see the need to set up a new mechanism or universal periodic review or peer review or periodic reporting system. Thank you.
Thank you. Next one on the speakers list is Colombia.
Many thanks indeed, Mr. Chair. For Colombia as a country of origin, transit, and more recently a country of destination, the issue of migration is a crucial one. I wish to refer to the issue of shared responsibility. As when we talk about the concept of shared responsibility, it brings me to talk about the fact that on a number of occasions and in various fora, including during the General Assembly of the United Nations, well, the South American Conference on Migration and the Global Forum on Migration and Development, Colombia has always pledged to uphold this concept of shared responsibility. Colombia has made it clear that international cooperation is crucial if we are to protect the rights of migrants. They have inherent rights to mobility and free movement. We note with concern that when it comes to obligatory readmission agreements, that what's actually happening is widespread forced deportation. Safe, orderly and regular migration and the pact thereon involves dealing with migration and regularizing it. Indeed, we do need to regularize migration and open new pathways therefore, but also render entry and exit more flexible and the conditions for that process more flexible. Migrants must be protected regardless of their migratory status, and protecting them involves increasing regularization. Regularization is the only pathway that will allow migrants to be made visible. It will stop us having smuggling pathways and trafficking pathways which ultimately enrich international criminals. The Global Compact should enrich international agreements in general and pave the way for more regularizing pathways to be created. Thank you.
Thank you, Colombia. Next one on the speakers list is Brazil, followed by Bangladesh and the Russian Federation. Brazil, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moderator. We understand that the Global Compact main contribution would be to tackle irregular migration. It's expected to do so, and it should do so from a human rights perspective. We believe that the vulnerability of undocumented migrants, who are often rendered invisible to the state and more susceptible to human rights violations, makes irregular migration an issue of a human rights concern. In this respect, we as an international community should commit to expand and create regular pathways of admission as an essential measure to curb the smuggling of migrants and human trafficking, as well as to reduce the migrants' vulnerability and exposure to perilous migratory routes. This should encompass the creation of regular pathways to accommodate labor mobility objectives, as well as the creation of alternative channels of admission to migrants who do not qualify for refugee status, but are nonetheless in need of special protection, such as stateless persons and victims of natural disasters. Nevertheless, we should bear in mind that it's not possible to anticipate all situations that may give rise to irregular migration. Among other factors, severe economic or political crisis can lead to disorderly migration flows, which may be irregular given the emergency situation that leads people to migrate. Consequently, it's equally important to promote doors, ways, avenues for regularization of undocumented migrants, which is a crucial measure to reduce exploitation and abuse, as well as to enhance migrants' social inclusion. Simplifying the conversion between different types of visa may, in this respect, be important to prevent migrants from getting into irregular migratory status.
In light of the current
I'm
migratory
afraid you have
crisis,
to wrap up now.
Okay. We believe the Global Compact should direct the international community's efforts towards ending human rights violations resulting from so-called immigration detentions. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for pointing to the important question of vulnerability. The next speaker on my list is Bangladesh, followed by the Russian Federation. Bangladesh, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Migration indeed is a global phenomenon and we need global response to deal with it. So that the GCM should be an evolving and living document, simply yet substantively comprehensive and visionary. It has to be self-contained to address all aspects of migration and need to be an up-to-date one. For fulfilling the criteria that we envision, the compact ideally needs to be a legally binding document. In case of disagreement, the alternative option could be framing a hybrid document in which some parts are legally binding and some are not. It may also contain context-specific, non-binding guiding principles. Furthermore, the document should create scope for the member states to engage into further discourse on areas on which a convergence would not be possible during 2018. The GCM should be a policy instrument for regulating transborder human mobility by opening accessible, regular, safe and affordable migration channels and promoting and celebrating the diversities. The Global Compact for Migration objective should essentially be to enhance the international cooperation to ensure safe, orderly and regular migration involving full respect for human rights and the human treatment of migrants regardless of their migration status, embolden the element of global governance in the field of international migration. Also need to be dispel all misperceptions about such global governance so that member states could embrace it without the prejudice of compromising on sovereign rights. Proper integration of migrants and providing them with access to basic services are to be ensured through capacity and resilience building measures in host community. The compact must have clear provisions for all of this. Migration related evidence-based data collection remains the cornerstone for success. Proponents for forced and irregular migration are to be addressed in the compact and sustainable solution for tackling such conflict crisis related plights need to be figured out. Climate change induced large scale displacement and root causes of internal displacements are also to be taken into full consideration. While framing the zero draft, it should be kept in mind that the operative paragraphs are to be target-based, implementable and reviewable like those in 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. For making the Global Compact for Migration functional, there is no alternative of attaining greater global political endorsement in its favor. Given the current nature of global politics and rise of more nationalist chauvinist ideologies escalating, granting this and securing higher level of sincere political support will be critical for it. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to ask speakers to deliver their remarks at a normal speed in order for the interpreters to be provided properly, and thank you for your cooperation, and also try to stick to the 2 minutes so that as many delegations as possible will be able to take the floor. Now, Russian Federation, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, for us, the Global Compact is something that should not be a legally binding document, nor should it provide for the monitoring mechanisms for future activities, follow-up mechanisms, that is. For us, these are political commitments which need to be undertaken, and program of action as well, and the possibility for voluntary reporting on the parts of states. As regards the contents of the Global Compact, we think that first of all, we need to concentrate on the issues having to do with development economics. Migration is an economic phenomenon. The Compact has to provide for the understanding of the fact that in order to normalize a situation with migration, what we need to do is to have the proper regulation of migration processes and flows. Resolving other accompanying issues, such as, for example, the human rights components, combating trafficking, smuggling in migrants, is something that needs to be done via resolving the economic issues, and this is something we need to concentrate on. The Compact, we think, needs to touch upon the issues of the differentiating approach to regulating the migratory flows and processes, and the development of international cooperation in this area, both at the regional as well as the global level. And the last point. Now, it's important not to confuse the economic and humanitarian issues. What we're witnessing now is many people mixing migration issues and refugee issues. We have to make sure that these two are very clearly distinguished, because these are two different areas covered by economic law and the rights of refugees. Thank you.
Thank you, Russian Federation. Next one on my speakers list is ILO, followed by the President of the NHRI of Mexico on behalf of the ANRHRI, followed by Australia. ILO, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. And since most migration today is linked directly or indirectly to the search for decent work opportunities, we think the Global Compact can be effective in addressing labor migration challenges if it's linked to the SDGs on decent work, and specifically target 8.8 on the protection of all workers, including migrant workers and particularly women. It would be important for the Compact to consider commitments to adopt fair labor migration frameworks that are evidence-based, gender-sensitive, grounded on international labor standards and decent work, including the fundamental principles and rights at work. The commitments would include 4 areas of priority action. The first is promoting universal ratification and implementation of ILO conventions, including our Migration Conventions 97 and number 143. And this can ensure policy coherence between employment and labor migration policies, as well as social protection. This also requires the engagement of social partners in the dialogue. Second, adopting fair recruitment mechanisms across migration corridors based on ILO's general principles and operational guidelines on fair recruitment. These can help eliminate worker-paid fees in line with SDG indicator on recruitment cost 10.7.1. The third is skills development, labor market forecasting, and skills recognition, which can inform skills and job matching at both national and international levels and improve migration outcomes. ILO has committed to work with member states and agency partners to foster regional and global skills platforms which engage workers and employers organizations and all stakeholders to strengthen their input and to help reintegration of migrant workers returning home. And fourth, to include commitments for cooperation on the collection and production of labor migration statistics that are based on guidelines to be adopted by ILO's Intergovernmental Working Group under the International Conference on Labor Statisticians next year. ILO remains committed to support member states in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, ILO, and thank you for mentioning important issues of decent work and fair recruitment. Next one on my speakers list is the President of the NHRI of Mexico on behalf of GAMRI. Please, the floor is yours.
Many thanks indeed, Mr. Chairman. National human rights institutions and the global alliance thereof wishes to state that nations are jointly responsible. September last year, the document that we had, the New York Declaration, outlined the fact that there needs to be a common understanding of the Global Compact. And indeed, the Global Compact, it was agreed that the Global Compact had to point to the benefits of migration. For national human rights institutions, it is pivotal to ensure that efforts to produce this pact are not watered down, are not watered down. And to ensure that that does not happen, we argue that there should be a monitoring and oversight mechanism accompanying the Global Compact. This mechanism has to be based on the principle of consistency, and we outlined this yesterday. Of course, the ILO, IOM, UNHCR, and the Agenda 2030 are all agencies and documents that have to be aligned with this Global Compact and this oversight mechanism, and all of our work needs to be in line with the recommendations issued from UN agencies. The ratification of treaties related to migration is also important. By way of example, I would cite the treaty related to the protection of migrant workers and their families. It is important that nations accede to and/or ratify as appropriate conventions pertaining to such protection. I wish to emphasize during this discussion on the global dimension of migration the importance of the humanitarian dimension of migration as a cross-cutting issue, because it is important that we use as a starting point for our work the dignity of human persons. It's important that there be no discrimination of migrants and that they receive decent, dignified treatment throughout the migration cycle, particularly when we are having a discussion on the global dimension of migration. Now, within the discussions on this global dimension, we need to understand the distinct nature of the vulnerabilities of each and every group of migrants. I'm talking about girls, boys and adolescents. They have certain vulnerabilities. Different genders have different vulnerabilities. That needs to be taken into account, as does the issue of the access to justice and the issue of human trafficking and smuggling. And national human rights institutions can act as facilitators to ensure that the Global Compact is monitored and followed upon. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Australia, followed by Thailand and Liechtenstein. Australia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Our point of departure is that the GCM will be voluntary and legally non-binding. In terms of commitments, we'd like to see a strengthened commitment by states to collaborate on migration, particularly galvanised by shared best practices. We'd also like to see a commitment to address the root causes of displacement and irregular migration, and commitments to support political and peace-building efforts. Thinking about the implementation and particularly a possible follow-up mechanism, we'd like to see a low-cost and light-touch follow-up arrangement in relation to the commitments in the GCM. This means not monitoring and reviewing, but rather mapping and assisting states as we work through our voluntary commitments. In light of this, we see a central role for IOM in conjunction with relevant UN agencies in supporting the implementation. IOM is the only organisation exclusively dedicated to migration. Other agencies also have an important role to play and have pieces of the pie. We're still developing our thinking, but we could envisage a kind of hub and spoke model with IOM at the hub of the follow-up and developing incredibly effective partnerships with other agencies that have important parts of the migration and mobility equation. There are various practical options, but we'd be looking for something that already existed. One could be IOM's IDM, which with some small retweaks, it's an existing mechanism and it could be made more inclusive, and it could be a flexible and nimble way of states mapping and voluntary reporting on the commitments they've undertaken through the Compact. Thank you.
Thank you, Australia, and thank you for being so concrete. Next one on my speakers list is Thailand, followed by Liechtenstein. Thailand, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. For Thailand in the global dimension, regional and international cooperation on migration management is our national priority. And for the actionable commitment, Thailand would recommend that in the Global Compact for Migration, regional and international cooperation to ensure cross-border control of migration flows and coordination of the best practices to be promoted. So for the means of implementation, we have 6 recommendations. 1, improve country-level coordination on migration management practices across the region. In particular, enhance information sharing and collaboration between governments of sending and receiving countries. 2, enhance scope of coordination at the field level between frontline officials in host countries and those of neighboring countries. 3, establish tailored bilateral labor agreements concerning the deployment of migrant workers from a source country to work in certain key industries to improve migration management for both states and better protect migrant workers in the industry. 4, support development of harmonized standard operating procedures to facilitate regional cohesion in approach towards migration management between sending and receiving states. 5, engage with international organizations' expertise on travel document inspection to ensure false or fake travel documents at point of entry, including training of frontline border officials on how to recognize imposters, signs of tampering and false travel documents. 6, member states should share good practices among each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thailand, and thank you for being so concrete. Next one on the speakers list is Liechtenstein, followed by New Zealand and Spain. Liechtenstein, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Mr. Moderator, having followed this process actively since its inception, we have come to the view that a large majority of states shares the view that this process is a chance to increase and strengthen global migration governance, and not only at the global level, but at all levels, and we certainly share that view. We consider the Compact as a very important opportunity to take a step ahead in that regard, and I would just like to mention a couple of points that have already been raised by other delegations that we also think are important. The first one is strengthened governance at the level of UN institutions. We certainly share the view that the Compact provides the opportunity to strengthen coherence and to avoid further fragmentation of efforts. This does not mean, of course, that we should not have efforts at all levels that are pertinent to migration governance. Second, at the intergovernmental level, we've said it yesterday, we will certainly engage actively in ensuring strong modalities to review implementation of the commitments we're going to have in the framework of the Compact. In our view, the review of implementation should be primarily conducted in a format that provides universal access to all states and other stakeholders, and that is closely aligned with corresponding processes in the framework of the SDGs, so we can ensure that the synergies for both agendas are maximally exhausted. Finally, I would like to also support a point that was made before I was taking the floor, and that is that the Compact should make a contribution to the universalization of existing legal instruments. And I'm thinking first and foremost, of course, about the Palermo regime, including its two very important additional protocols on the smuggling of migrants and trafficking in persons, but not only limited to that regime. There are other instruments that would greatly benefit from additional push towards universalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Liechtenstein. I have a small announcement before I give the floor to the next delegation. I just want to remind you about those cards on actionable commitments that you all have on your tables. So please fill them in, and there's a box outside this room where you can put them. Thank you. Next one on my speakers list is New Zealand, followed by Spain and Chile. New Zealand, please, the floor is yours.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. New Zealand is a country of migrants. We are both a country of origin and of destination. Migration is a key component of our prosperity and growth. We'd like to propose that we have three key priorities for the Global Compact. Firstly, the Global Compact on Migration should continue to support legal pathways to provide migration benefits for individual migrants, communities and countries of destination and origin. Secondly, we reject migrant exploitation, human trafficking, people smuggling, xenophobia and discrimination. However, we note that these are not problems that individual states can solve on their own. They require a concerted global approach involving cooperation between origin, transit and destination states. Thirdly, the Global Compact needs to be inclusive and founded on our existing human rights commitments and obligations. In terms of implementation, we need to ensure that the capacities and needs of all states are considered, especially small developing island states. We support actionable commitments that strengthen international cooperation, the sharing of best practice and capacity development. In that regard, we propose a commitment to accelerate action to reduce the transaction costs of migrant remittances and to eliminate remittance corridors with costs of higher than 5%. So we reiterate our commitment to the G20 and SDG targets. However, we think that as member states we can work to accelerate the implementation of those targets, obviously while still maintaining our anti-money laundering and countering of terrorism finance requirements. Globally, the volume of remittances far outweigh global aid spending and therefore have far greater development impact on families and communities in developing countries. According to the World Bank, remittances are worth $628 million US per year to the Pacific region alone. Due to the scale and reliance on remittances in the Pacific, lowering the cost of remittances is essential to ensure migration for labour maximises returns for workers and their communities. The International Finance Corporation has successfully piloted a voucher-based remittance system to facilitate remittances between New Zealand and Tonga. We'd like to highlight this as potential best practice as an example for other states. New Zealand and Australia are now working with the IFC to identify ways of replicating this system more widely as a remittance solution. We would encourage this globally and other good ideas that countries have. Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand, and thank you for mentioning the use of inclusiveness. Next on my speakers list is Spain, followed by Chile, and then Pakistan. Spain, please, the floor is yours.
Sí, presidente, muchas gracias.
Many thanks, Mr. Moderator. Spain endorses the statement made by the European Union and wishes to say that we endorse the majority of the comments presented by delegations from other member states. Nevertheless, I will focus my statement on the global focus that this compact should have. On the first day of this conference, we saw that the global migration is a global phenomenon, and it is a problem that needs to be dealt with, and in that connection we need to open more regular pathways for migration. And that change in conception is a step forward, but nevertheless that change in perception, but we believe that the Global Compact needs to build on that change in order to bring about a change in migration paradigms. We could be wrong, but we believe that this Global Compact should, in light of the above, take into consideration four key principles. First of all, what we're talking about here is ensuring that the Global Compact is really global, and that it ensures it makes migration safe, regular, and more orderly, because we know that that is not the case today. Or at least it's not the case to the extent that we all wish it to be so. We cannot resign ourselves to the fact that we continue to see notable quantities of involuntary, unwished, undesired migration, people migrating because they don't want to migrate. That we can't continue to see that. Agenda 2030 talks about tackling the root causes of migration. We should do that, and in that connection we should have a follow-up mechanism for this compact. We know that migration is a lasting phenomenon. It's a normal, natural phenomenon which arises from globalization. Therefore it is a phenomenon which will continue, is here to stay, but we should, in light of that, avoid trends which see us put proposals on the table which are good and positive, but perhaps too short-term and too short-sighted in focus. We should adopt a long-term approach. We could be wrong again, but in light of the above, we believe that the Global Compact should strike a proper balance between ambition. Of course, we are compelled to be ambitious following the New York Declaration of 2016, but there needs to be a balance between ambition and realism. And we need to show solidarity and share responsibilities. Many thanks, Moderator.
Thank you, Spain. The next one on the speakers list is Chile, followed by Pakistan, and then UNDISA. Chile, please, the floor is yours.
I have 7 points. Thank you very much. Chile believes in a GCM that will clearly spell out the relationship among national, regional, and global dimensions. 2, we see the global dimension as a coordination and follow-up framework that, while state-led, includes meaningful participation by UN partners and all other stakeholders. 3, it should be linked to the implementation and review of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which should be built in and influence all of government efforts at national level. The elements that we can foresee for such a follow-up framework are at least 3: benchmark and regular review of progress in implementation of actionable commitments, capacity building according to priorities, and ongoing broad-based dialogue to build consensus and address emerging issues. My 5th point, this framework requires a fit-for-purpose institutional architecture to support all above elements and should build on existing systems and mechanisms at regional level, existing consultative processes at global level, options mostly focus on the IOM with its international dialogue on migration and its broad-based council, as well as 3rd, a robust UN system interagency coordination at global, regional, and national level. My 6th point, such follow-up review architecture would need to have a multi-year program of work, including reporting on an annual basis and a dedicated secretariat for specific GCM activities such as an annual conference, reporting to the GA, better data, and dialogues. And my last point and 7th point, IOM's broad migration mandate reaffirmed last week in the 108th Council Resolution 1358 on the first anniversary of the IOM within the UN, plus its extensive presence on the ground and rich technical and policy expertise, mean that it is well placed to act as secretariat prepared for the GCM follow-up, coordination and review from Geneva, home to most of the international agencies involved. While additional funding will be required, IOM existing capacity ensures that GCM implementation takes place in a cost-effective manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Chile, for a very concrete intervention. Next one on my speakers list is Pakistan, followed by UNDESA. Pakistan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, for this opportunity. In the interest of time, I would like to reiterate a few quick points in relation to the global dimension of the Global Compact. Mr. Moderator, our expectation is that the Global Compact should provide a comprehensive framework covering all aspects and dimensions to promote safe, orderly, and regular migration, with follow-up as its integral part. It should promote human rights-based approach to matters related to migration and contribute to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular the SDG 10.7. It should seek to enhance cooperation among countries of origin, transit, and destination, promote UN-wide coordination and coherence, as well as forge multi-stakeholder partnership on migration. While recognizing that remittances are private income, it should pave the way for concrete progress in reducing the cost associated with the transfer of remittances to less than 3%. It should prevent and address xenophobia, discrimination, and intolerance more effectively. And finally, Mr. Moderator, the Global Compact should retain the distinction between refugees and migrants. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pakistan. Next one on the speakers list is UNDESA, followed by ACT Alliance, and then the Special Rapporteur on International Solidarity. So please, UNDESA, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to speak on data on international migration from a global perspective. And this is an intervention that has been prepared by DESA and IOM with contributions from ILO, OECD, UN Women, UNFPA, WHO, and the World Bank. In virtually every consultation thus far on the Global Compact, member states and other stakeholders have highlighted the urgent need to strengthen migration data, training, and research. Today, allow me to highlight the necessity of a global approach on data and the importance of global cooperation on data. Regarding a global approach on data, although there may be national and regional specificities in migration, we should continue to apply global standards for data collection, and we should build global databases of core indicators on migration. A global approach to data is the only way to ensure the availability of consistent and comparable information on migration trends, drivers, and impacts. In the Global Compact, we propose that there should be a chapter or a section of a chapter dedicated to articulating a global vision of how to improve the available data and evidence on migration. For example, within a chapter on implementation, there could be a dedicated section on improving migration data training and research. Regarding global cooperation on data, the follow-up to the Global Compact would benefit from a global program for building national capacities to collect, disseminate, and analyze migration-related data. Such a global program would provide a means of addressing data gaps, assessing migration trends, and monitoring the implementation of commitments. To ensure a baseline of global data on the number and characteristics of international migrants, there is no substitute for population censuses. Countries are encouraged to include migration-related questions in their censuses during the 2020 round. The core migration questions include country of birth, country of citizenship, year or period of arrival, and reasons for migration. Countries should ensure the timely analysis and dissemination of census data, including data disaggregated by age, sex, and migrant status. In a spirit of cooperation, countries should provide detailed information on country of birth and country of citizenship of their resident populations. Such information provides the only practical means for countries to keep track of the number of their nationals living abroad. That is, by consulting data generated by censuses and surveys conducted in other countries. Lastly, Mr. Chair, to promote a global dialogue on migration data, DESA, IOM, and OECD are organizing the first ever International Forum on Migration Statistics, which will take place in Paris on the 15th to the 16th of January 2018. This forum will provide a venue for experts, policymakers, and representatives of civil society to exchange ideas on data and evidence to improve the global understanding of migration. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dessa, and thank you for this show of UN coordination. Again, I must remind speakers to try and keep within the 2 minutes frame. Next one on my speakers list is the ACT Alliance. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've heard several very good suggestions and ideas from states and other stakeholders today, and we welcome the spirit of open discussion. At the global level, the following commitments for a global compact on migration would be important from our view. First, an increase and enhanced access to regular pathways for migration across all sectors, in keeping with established labor rights standards and relevant ILO conventions, and based on comprehensive, long-term, and honest labor market analyses within and between countries. Secondly, avoiding a compact that focuses primarily on facilitating enhanced returns. We are concerned about the current inconsistency in standards related to assessing the voluntariness of return decisions, the transparency and human rights compatibility of readmission agreements, and effective and independent post-return monitoring in countries of origin. Furthermore, reintegration of returning migrants is an area that has not been consistently addressed in global processes so far and would need a much more robust and participatory engagement with migrants and their communities themselves in order to make it sustainable. Finally, we would like to draw attention to the need for ensuring complementarity between the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees in order to ensure that issues such as the two mentioned above, which potentially affect people on the move which do not easily fall into the categories ostensibly covered by both compacts, can be addressed in an integrated and human rights respecting manner. In order to ensure this, reference should be made in the compact text to the commitments affecting these populations, and provisions should be made in the monitoring and implementation mechanism that would ensure regular and effective exchange between states and other stakeholders, including affected migrants and refugees themselves, about the progress towards achieving relevant goals. Thank you.
Thank you. Next one on the speakers list is the Special Rapporteur on International Solidarity. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. As described in the draft declaration on the right to international solidarity, the concept of preventive solidarity is key to formulating an effective approach to this global compact on migration. The idea of preventive solidarity is that it is necessary to take collective action to build and safeguard human rights around the world and to proactively address global challenges, and thus to address the root causes of those challenges, including migration, in a way that fully balances the needs of all states. In order to ensure that the Global Compact efficiently and effectively serves its primary goal of protecting the human rights of all migrants, the review process or processes of the Global Compact should formally and explicitly incorporate the relevant findings of human rights processes, including the Universal Periodic Review, treaty body reports, and the reports of UN and regional special procedures that they get during their country visits. Put simply, the Global Compact should mandate input and consideration of human rights reports in the GCM review process. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Now on my speakers list is first Republic of Moldova, followed by Guyana and France. So, Republic of Moldova, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The Republic of Moldova underlines its continuing interest to contribute to the GCM process. It should build on the migration-related commitments under the Agenda for Sustainable Development, UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, international treaties, and to continue to the implementation of our national policies in migration and development. Upgrading and improving the governance on migration to address the challenges associated with today's migration is urgently needed. The existing partnerships at national and regional levels need to be reshaped and enhanced following the priorities of a renewed global approach to migration and mobility. From Moldova's best experience in implementing the mobility partnership with the European Union for almost 10 years and its active engagement with the GFMD Forum, the accumulated experience experience and expertise is already shared with different countries from the region and will continue to be multiplied and disseminated at national and international level. Thank you.
Thank you. Next one is Guyana, followed by France and then Lebanon. Guyana, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Guyana recognizes that in the global context, countries face different challenges and have varied capacities. Hence, the Global Compact, we believe, must consider mechanisms that will guarantee relevant support for developing countries toward facilitating meaningful implementation of the GCM, especially within the context of the SDGs. Mr. Chairman, we envisage a role for the IOM in helping to ensure follow-up and implementation of the Global Compact. The Compact needs to ensure, we believe, that issues affecting small island, developing, and low-lying states, including climate change and levels of development, and that those members that have obligations under perennial regional obligations take these these are taken into account as the compact is fashioned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Next one on the speakers list is France, followed by Lebanon and then Algeria. France, please, the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, moderator. Yes, I wanted to talk about the migration, which very frequently is symptomatic of something else. So the compact has to establish bridges with other issues, other problems which are dealt with in other documents and other fora. We talked about the 2030 agenda, that's altogether relevant, and I think there are other areas which we shouldn't forget amongst the root causes and which are also subjects to national international cooperation. Governance, for example, very frequently it's the dysfunctionality in states of origin that leads to migration, and as was showed yesterday, when migrants change conditions, they show that they're capable of creating value. Another point, the inequalities of regional development within a country. There are many disparities, including in the regions of countries which are origins of migration. So we need to be thinking about how we can pull a national, international means in the most vulnerable regions. Then the issue of women's empowerment, in particular in the area of girls' education, reproductive health. That's important when it comes to demographic issues. And lastly, the natural disasters and deterioration of the environment and climate change. Increasingly, there are people moving because of climate change. This was mentioned yesterday. The short-term answer is humanitarian in nature, but more long-term, what needs to be done is implementing the Paris Agreement on climate change throughout the world and respecting the timeline therein. This is indispensable, in particular, in the context of migration. Thank you.
Thank you, France, and thank you for pointing at some of the important drivers of migration. Next one on the speakers list would be Lebanon, followed by Algeria. Lebanon, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I will focus my intervention on the increasing tendency to point towards conflict as a driver of migration. While this can apply in the narrow sphere of people leaving conflict or post-conflict situations to seek economic opportunities elsewhere, it does not apply to those seeking protection from conflicts who are refugees, not migrants. In our understanding, forced displacement of people across borders, or seas for that matter, should be addressed within the context of the Compact on Refugees. We are alarmed by the introduction or suggestion of new concepts or categories that do not enjoy international consensus, such as forced migrants or forced migration. Wherever the principle of non-refoulement applies, we are talking about refugees, not migrants. The GCM should keep a clear distinction between the two categories, Blurring the lines will undermine the level of commitment and consensus in the GCM, which would neither serve the interests of migrants nor those of refugees. Thank you.
Thank you, Lebanon. Next on the speakers list is Algeria, followed by the Netherlands and then Togo. Algeria, please, the floor is yours.
International cooperation and partnerships are obviously essential at the level of development and implementation and monitoring of the Global Compact. Sharing responsibilities and the burdens between the countries of origin, transit, and destination is one of the elements that we need to include in the development of the Global Compact. The countries of origin, less and less so, but we now became a country of destination, and we have many legal instruments, regional and national, in particular those governing, combating human trafficking, protecting human rights, and protecting the migrant workers. Very briefly now, some of the principal priorities that my country would like to see reflected in the Global Compact on migration. Amongst those, I would quote the following: combating irregular migration and the networks of smugglers, strengthening the means of fighting the brain drain from countries in the south, partly because of the greater attractiveness of countries in the north, promoting the partnerships within the regions in the south and the involvement of the northern countries so as to invest in income-generating projects to which the diaspora can greatly contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the speakers list is the Netherlands, followed by Togo, and then UN Women. Netherlands, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to, of course, also align with the statement made by the representative of the European Union and pick up 5 things that we think are important as actionable commitments. One is to share information on the possibilities of legal migration, the possibilities that already exist. 2, confirmation of the SDG target 10C that was referred to by a number of colleagues on reducing the remittances, the costs of remittances. 3, we think the GCM should commit countries of origin, transit and destination to address root causes, all root causes, as was also mentioned by the French colleague, of irregular migration. That would include climate change, conflict, instability, but also lack of opportunities, as we heard yesterday. Lack of opportunities for youth. We think there should be a focus on opportunities for youth and also on sexual and reproductive health. 4, we think states should develop and implement transparent and coherent procedures to readmit their own nationals. And last but not least, we should include fighting trafficking and smuggling of human beings. Thank you.
Thank you, Netherlands, and thank you for the valid point on informing about the legal pathways that we actually have right now. Next one on the speakers list is Togo, followed by UN Women, then Global Campaign to End Child Detention. So Togo, please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, moderator. We in Togo think that migration is a social phenomenon, and therefore the Global Compact has to be based on this. And this means that the states had to soften the conditions surrounding entry on their territory. Nationally speaking, our priority is the development of community at the very lowest level, and this means cooperation not just among states and international organizations, but this also calls for the contribution from the diaspora. The 22 study shows that the contribution of the diaspora is at about 10% of the GNP in the country. We also think that we need to intensify cooperation in order to combat irregular migration, which is a reason for massive displacements today. Let me give an example here of the cooperation we have with Togo and Ghana and Benin. On the 1st of December, we agreed to share information on the network of smugglers in the region. So the pact could underscore these kinds of practices and have them implemented throughout the world. We also think that we need to establish a fund of extending assistance to migrants, and this could be used in cases of distress. Sometimes we have such cases where the states are very slow to come in, but because migrants have rights, we think that international action could be invoked here. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the speakers list is UN Women, followed by the Global Campaign to End Child Detention, and then Plurinational State of Bolivia. UN Women, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On behalf of UN Women, we want to submit the following points for consideration at the Global Compact on Migration. First, ensuring equal access for migrant women and girls to human rights-based and gender-responsive services, in particular access to healthcare services and specialized care for survivors of sexual violence, and access to justice for women at all stages of migration. Second, the ensuring access to information on the rights of women in all stages of migration, ensuring that migrant women have independent residency status to enable regularized and legal stay for women and women independent of a husband. And lastly, on strengthening data knowledge and evidence on migrant women and girls, we would propose measures that support robust qualitative and quantitative research to better understand the realities and contributions of migrant women and girls, as well as to build capacity to collect, analyze, and use high-quality, reliable, and timely data disaggregated by sex, age, income, and other characteristics relevant in national context. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for those concrete proposals. Next one is the Global Campaign to End Child Detention. The floor is yours.
The Global Campaign to End Child Immigration Detention is an ongoing civil society movement with more than 150 organisations across 40 countries. In line with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the recent joint general comments on the human rights of children in the situation of international migration, we advocate for children to be treated as children, to be free, to be looked after, and importantly, to be in the community with their families while awaiting migration status to be resolved. We commend the states who highlighted working towards developing alternatives to immigration detention for children as a priority during the stocktaking, particularly Brazil, Bolivia, the Dominican Republic, Egypt, and the Holy See. In the Global Compacts, we envisage that working towards ending immigration detention of children translates to a series of actionable commitments which many states have already begun to undertake, including developing national action plans, reporting on the numbers of children in detention, developing and implementing child-sensitive alternatives to immigration detention, reporting on the progress in CRC and UPR reports, and working towards prohibiting child immigration detention in law and regulation. I would like to draw your attention to the Child Rights Initiative document, Actionable Commitments for Children on the Move, which highlights opportunities to make a difference, a real difference for the lives of migrant children. It has a section on child immigration detention, which is also complemented by this roadmap to end child detention developed by the International Detention Coalition. I would draw your attention to a number of positive practices highlighted in that document that can hopefully inspire collective efforts towards making child immigration detention a thing of the past. Thank you.
Thank you. The floor now goes to the plurinational state of Bolivia, followed by the Holy See, Mexico, and Palau. The plurinational state of Bolivia, the floor is yours.
Many thanks indeed, Mr. Chairman. We believe that the Global Compact for Migration is an opportunity, a very important opportunity, crucial indeed, that will allow us to ensure that we state that the rights we talked about yesterday and today are cross-cutting. We believe as a state that the root causes of migration need to be tackled. The inequalities between states need to be rectified because these inequalities separate states of origin and states of destination. As regards governance, we need to talk about the current situation of migration. Indeed, what we're seeing in the migratory field now is a humanitarian crisis which requires attention, unconditional assistance to be afforded without delay. Migration needs to be made safe, orderly and regular, and that's just one aspect of dealing with the migration tragedy. We need to adopt a broader focus, a more integral one, and we need to have a compact which sees human rights be made cross-cutting. We need to talk in this context about a migration process. The Global Compact also needs to tackle human mobility in all its facets and look at it as a right. The Global Compact needs to facilitate and include the creation of a global body which promotes and protects the rights of migrants. We might have the Global Ombudsman, or you could call it the Ombudsman for the rights of migrant persons, refugees, asylum seekers, stateless persons, victims of trafficking and smuggling, or other victims. But having a global ombudsman who protects human rights and promotes human mobility is important. We need to have that body and commit to it. And of course, our compact needs to have binding material, I think, in it. We need to, in any case, have an obligation to build bridges and not walls.
Thank you. Next one on the speakers list is the Holy See, followed by Mexico, Palau, and the Philippines. Holy See, the floor is yours.
Thank you. One of the most vulnerable categories of migrants are the unaccompanied children. The Holy See would like to see the Global Compact underline universal best practices in the treatment of unaccompanied migrant children, in particular, like the following 3 ways. First, adopt alternative solutions to mandatory detention, which is never in the best interest of the child, no matter their migratory status. Second, provide foster care or guardianship for unaccompanied children or minors while they are separated from their family. Third, establish separate processing centers which respond specifically to the needs of unaccompanied migrant children. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to the Holy See for pointing to the challenges we see with unaccompanied minors in migratory situation. Next one on the speakers list is Mexico, followed by Palau and the Philippines. Mexico, please, the floor is yours.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Many thanks, Mr. Moderator. The global dimension of migration is crucial. We need to focus on it if we are to achieve the goals of the Global Compact for Migration. I'm going to refer to a number of things that are relevant for my country in this connection. First of all, based on the principle of shared responsibility. Well, this principle means that all countries, be they countries of origin, transit or destination, need to adopt measures to contribute to ensuring that migration is regular, safe and orderly. My second point, migration policies need to ensure that when countries adopt migration policy, need to bear in mind the effects of these policies on third countries, and this is particularly pertinent in connection to visa elimination policies and visa issuance policies, and these need to be evaluated. A number of delegations have referred to the importance of disaggregated data, and I would point to the urgent need of it to ensure that these data need to recognise the contribution that migrants make to development. As we've seen in yesterday's discussions, such data is crucial if we are to change common misperceptions of migration and the xenophobic views of migration. We need to tackle the root causes of migration. I think a number of delegations have already touched on that. My fifth point, the importance of having mechanisms which make it possible to facilitate the return of migrants to their countries of origins. Costa Rica already referred to the fact that mechanisms are important, or mechanisms of this nature, where we're seeing migratory trends according to which migrants come from countries very far from home and come from countries and go to countries where no protection mechanisms are in place, and neither are there mechanisms which facilitate their return. Now, my last point would be the importance of coordination between international organizations. If we are to ensure the consistent implementation of the Global Compact, such cooperation would mean not only cooperation between UN bodies, but cooperation with regional organizations and, for example, the World Bank, among others. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico, and thank you for pointing to the contributions that migrants make to development. Next one on my speakers list is Philippines, followed by Ethiopia, ICRC, Women in Migration Networks. The Philippines, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Given the limited amount of time, this list is by no means exhaustive. In terms of national priorities, our most priority is the protection of the rights of migrants regardless of migration status, as well as addressing drivers of migration. Capacity building is also a priority, and building on the 2030 agenda and the SDGs is foremost, given that the GCM is not a standalone framework. On actionable commitments, we would like to have an encouraging the development of soft law frameworks for decent work, such as, for instance, considering a code of conduct on ethical recruitment. We'd also like to see actionable commitments on crisis management mechanisms, expanding avenues for regular labor migration, as well as on social and financial inclusion and access to these services, and as well as the reduction of remittance costs. In terms of MOI, we would like to see strengthened data gathering and capacity building in relation to this, as well as some delegations have already mentioned this earlier, mapping of migrant populations by both sending and destination countries so that we can have evidence-based policies in relation to them. And information sharing in relation to this is also important, as well as the use of ICT and social media. In terms of partnerships, we would like to see strengthened South-South cooperation and regional cooperation, given that most migration is interregional. And we'd also like to see increased engagement of stakeholders. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Philippines. Next one is Ethiopia. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. We welcome and share most of the recommendations and actionable commitments by previous speakers, and we would like to include the following as well. The first one is, in terms of the actionable commitment, we would like to see the GCM include support to support states in capacity building through effective and functional partnership, proper diaspora mapping, institutional capacity building, and evidence policy making. And second, we believe that it should include to increase social remittances. The GCM should support states develop normative frameworks, particularly in harnessing knowledge diaspora networks. And third, it should support countries meet the Addis Ababa Action Agenda to promote financial inclusion and literacy, and to reduce transaction costs to less than 3% with no corridor with a higher 5% to address obstacles to flows of remittances, including banks. 4, promote circular migration to address the brain drain trend into brain circulation, so that skill benefit all regions, origin, transit, and destination. And final one, it should recognize the immense contributions that migrants and diaspora communities make to development, enhance the capacity of states to exploit this potential in both countries of origin and destination. I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Ethiopia, and thank you for putting our attention to capacity building and also the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Next one on my speakers list is ICRC. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I have 3 points that are hopefully actionable points for the GCM. All 3 are points related to protection needs of migrants. The number 1, we call on states to commit to working together to prevent and address cases of missing migrants and the needs of their families. Given that people travel across countries and regions and might go missing at any point in their journey, international cooperation is key to addressing the question of missing migrants. Second point, so number 2, relates to detention of migrants. Detention is not merely a tool to manage migration. It has lasting consequences on people's mental health and comes at a great cost for societies. In the case of children, the impact is even more profound. We urge states to commit to avoiding immigration detention and, when it comes to children, to commit to ending their detention for reasons related to their migratory status or that of their parents. If there are grounds for deprivation of liberty, alternatives to detention should always be considered first. And thirdly, states should pledge to avoid using force to manage migration, in particular to prevent migrants from reaching borders or from accessing international protection. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next one on the speakers list is Women in Migration Network, followed by Iraq, Egypt, Islamic Republic of Iran. Women in Migration Network, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The Women Migration Network is also a member of the Global Coalition on Migration. We've been very appreciative of governments that are naming the priority of gender-sensitive compact on migration throughout the day today, but there's a concern that women are often being lumped into a laundry list of vulnerable populations without addressing the distinct realities of women and girls in migration. Women are not inherently vulnerable. We would not want to see a box in the Global Compact that simply laundry list lumps so-called vulnerable populations as the only way that women's concerns are addressed. Migrant women are made vulnerable by certain migration policies, so specific recommendations on gender policy have to be throughout the compact. We also don't want to see a gender sensitivity or engendering the document that engenders policy that would be focused on expansion of temporary labor programs that make women more vulnerable, or on detention and returns, because that's not the kind of gender equality that's needed. We feel that the global migration governance should strengthen coherence among the expertise of multiple UN agencies without giving primacy to one agency. This might be done by strengthening the office of the SRSG on migration as the principal coordinating body working within the normative human rights framework of the UN. Monitoring, review, and implementation mechanisms should address how existing institutional frameworks and processes can be strengthened with targets at the national, regional, and global levels. We want coherence with the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration. We want to see the protection of the rights of human rights defenders upheld. And we want to see the organized participation of migrants, grassroots organizations, civil society, and trade unions, including migrant women, in the implementation with specific mechanisms for civil society inclusion. And finally, we suggest that the follow-up mechanism assign a women's rapporteur to oversee the follow-up process at every stage so that we can guarantee that the visibility of women in migration is present at all times. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for reminding us that women are not inherently vulnerable. The next one is Iraq, followed by Egypt and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iraq, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to share a few points of national view on global migration governance. We believe the Global Compact should reaffirm the principle of shared responsibility between countries of origin and destination, and develop balanced approaches to protect the rights of migrants and their families, and raise awareness of their duties in the countries of destination. Second, respect human rights principles for all persons who are forced to leave their countries, regardless of their legal status during their transit or the country of destination. Third, developing effective approach that is based on accurate information coming from sharing and analyzing data on migration. Incorporating migration and development policies at the national, regional, and international levels in consistence with 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and national development plans. We believe promoting partnerships and cooperation on regional and international levels to facilitate the voluntary return of migrants, especially the professionals and the educated, is vital for revitalizing the economies of countries of origin. Finally, we would like to reiterate the importance of providing clear distinction between refugees and migrants in the Global Compact for Migration. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next one on the speakers list is Egypt. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. We would like to take this opportunity to express our point of view regarding some actionable commitments for the global dimension of the Global Compact. First, as expressed by others today, we need to address the drivers of migration. In this regard, it is imperative to implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We also agree with the comments made that fostering sustainable development is essential to addressing such drivers. These should not be solely limited to issues pertaining to remittances, but should also seek to leverage investments and official development assistance directed towards poverty eradication, education, healthcare services, job creation, and inclusive economic development in countries of origin. Second, we need to create and expand regular pathways to migration, including humanitarian, circular migration, and labor mobility schemes. Since we have already touched on this point in the morning session, we will not expound further here. Third, we need to strengthen global economic governance of migration, including through encouraging cooperation between countries of origin and countries of destination in order to jointly develop holistic global principles on return, readmission, and reintegration, and to develop rights-based policy programs for returning migrants. Fourth, we should seek to create remittances reduced corridors in accordance with the 2030 Agenda and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Finally, we affirm that we need to maintain a conceptual distinction between the two phenomena of migration and refugees in order to be able to achieve convergence on specific commitments in this regard. I thank you.
Thank you. Next one on my speakers list is the Islamic Republic of Iran, followed by Switzerland, Jamaica, and Burkina Faso. Islamic Republic of Iran, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Iran is a country of origin, transit, and destination for migration, and it attaches importance to the GCM. We are of the view that the balanced and comprehensive approach towards migration is the key to success for GCM. From a global perspective, ample attention should be paid to imbalanced development among countries as a root cause for migration, among other things. In this context, we share the opinion that the developed countries should honor their commitments to developing countries, including through transfer of technology, ODA also providing technical assistance upon their request. We also see human rights in tandem with development aspect, where eradication of poverty and right to development composes its critical elements. We are also of the opinion that international cooperation and national sovereignty are complementary for a successful implementation of GCM. Taking into consideration the different nature of refugees and migration issues, we would like to re-emphasize on clear distinction between these two issues to be reflected in GCM. And finally, we share the view that the GCM should not be a legally binding document. I thank you.
Thank you. I now have Switzerland on the speakers list. I can say that there is still some possibility if there are still delegations who want to take the floor. I have some 10 on the list right now, so there's still some possibility. Now, Switzerland, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I would like to start by joining many other governments, and in particular Liechtenstein, who highlighted the importance of the Global Compact on migration to strengthen the global governance on migration. I think this is indeed an important objective that we should keep in mind. A global governance that remains still fragmented despite an important decision taken last year to bring IOM closer and within the UN family. I think we still have some work to do. An important step was done, but the GCM has to address other issues as well. We will talk more tomorrow about the follow-up and review process, so I will limit today's comments to 3 possible actionable commitments, more generally speaking, and remaining at the global dimension of the Global Compact. An actionable commitment could foresee the possibility of creating a demand-driven capacity-building facility I think capacity building remains an incredible important aspect of moving forward with the implementation of the Global Compact, and such a facility would allow to respond to the demands from governments and other actors. IOM is certainly very well placed to play a key role in such a facility. They do have the instruments, including the Migration Governance Framework and others, to help governments in strengthening their capacities. A second actionable commitment could be around the issue of knowledge and data. We have to strengthen, and this has been mentioned by many delegations, including UNDESA before, the issue around data, but also about knowledge base and creating bridges between such a knowledge and data hub and the implementation process of the Global Compact could certainly facilitate our common objectives. A third actionable commitment should be around the issue of multi-stakeholder alliances, something that has already been recognized in the New York Declaration. But in the context of the Global Compact for migration, I think we should move ahead in being more precise on what such multi-stakeholder alliances could look like in the implementation of the Global Compact, looking at the possibility to work closer with the private sector, with civil society and other actors. I would like to end by reacting to 2 points that were raised by several delegations today. The first one mentioned by, among others, the Special Rapporteur and ICRC on the issue of missing. I think this is indeed an important point that could be very well reflected in the Global Compact. Missing and death during the migration path is an important point and should be reflected in the Global Compact with an appropriate commitment to address this issue. And the second point, many delegations raised the important issue of reducing the cost of remittances. Switzerland remains fully committed to the target in the 2030 agenda, but we just like to add the issue of financial inclusion, which goes hand in hand with the reduction of the cost of remittances. Financial inclusion has been reflected in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. I think this is something that goes hand in hand with the issue, with the points raised around remittances. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next on the speakers list is Jamaica, followed by Burkina Faso.
Thank you, Chair. 2 related points on governance. The Compact should define a clear governance structure for monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of the Compact. The IOM, as the central organization for migration, should play the key role at the global and regional levels. And the other point is, international migration is weakly governed in countries of origin. The Compact should place strong emphasis on the need for building strong governance mechanisms and infrastructure in the countries of origin to facilitate the monitoring of the implementation of the Compact. Those are my 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you. Next one on the speakers list is Burkina Faso, followed by WHO, International Catholic Migration Commission, and Cuba. Burkina Faso, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, moderator. The Global Pact should be able to deal with the root causes of migration and the compounding factors such as poverty, climate change, insecurity, the lack of future prospects for the young people, and the drop in ODA. And it also should be able in the economic development of women, given the increasingly female picture of development. For this, the Compact has to strengthen the link between the SDGs and the Africa Agenda 2063. International cooperation also has to be heightened in order to accompany the voluntary return of migrants, in particular the return of brain drain, those who are coming back in order to work in industrial development, healthcare, etc. Also, certain barriers have to be removed when it comes to the transfer of funds in developing countries, without taking away from our determination of fighting money laundering. Another aspect here, we need to involve the traditional leaders. The Pope yesterday, for example, launched an appeal. So the religious leaders have an important role to play when it comes to partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is WHO. Floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. In line with the framework of priority and guiding principle to promote the health of refugees and migrants, as well mentioned by Switzerland this morning, WHO with IOM and partners have developed the paper, the proposed health components in the GCM. It is available online. WHO would like to highlight some of the proposed actionable commitments as follows. 1. Ensuring that the right to health is upheld regardless of migratory status. 2nd, ensuring that migrants have equal access to quality health services and determinants of health without discrimination and regardless of status. This may require modifying legal framework and identifying healthcare financing model that will allow equal access to health services. 3rd, providing health services that are universal, migrant-centered, and gender responsive to specific health needs of migrants, in particular women and children. This may require health system strengthening. 4th, strengthening health information system in order to access and analyze trends in migrant health, disaggregating health information by relevant categories while respecting national regulations and confidentiality and personal data protection. With this, we also need to ensure clear firewall of healthcare providers and law enforcement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next one is International Catholic Migration Commission, followed by Cuba, Austria, and Turkey. International Catholic Migration Commission, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. I'm representing civil society. We're connected and we speak with a collective voice. To talk a little bit about priorities. Civil society, as our governments, we are not monolithic and we have different opinions and stakes, but there are so many issues on which we come together. And I'm going to name a selection of 4. The normative framework exists. The compact should in no way go back on them, but look at how to ratify and implement them. At least, and as a minimum, the compact should end child immigration detention and end the criminalization of migrants. We welcome states to look at the documents developed by the Initiative on Child Rights in both global compacts, and in particular the roadmap that was already mentioned before. The Global Compact should expand safe and regular pathways, especially for those migrants who are vulnerable, and it should include clear commitments on regularization. Return should always be voluntary and conducted in ways that respect rights, safety, and dignity of all migrants. To talk about commitments, this weekend, ICMC convened a meeting where over 70 civil society organizations came together to talk about joint advocacy strategies. And we used the Now and How 10 Acts document, which is now signed over 200 networks. You can find copies in front of the room, but the 10 Acts document brings forward a civil society vision, but not the only vision, one that brings together our advocacy work at the GFMD Civil Society Days last year, and our work ahead of the high-level summit. But it also includes important language that we can see in the New York Declaration and Agenda 2030. So it looks at issues and commitments you have already agreed upon. So in our 2 days, we invited governments, and we were really happy to welcome over 44 of you all with us in the room to discuss the different issues in the 10 Acts document. And we really hope that this dialogue continues and further expands with all of you in the room. Implementation and partnerships. This compact will only work with a strong UN, with a clear follow-up and review process, and with enough resources to make it work. And then lastly, many of us work with migrants and refugees on the ground. And civil society challenges you all to look at how both compacts talk together in practice on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next on my speakers list is Cuba, followed by Austria, Turkey, Senegal, and Finland. Cuba, the floor is yours.
Okay, gracias.
Many thanks. We are here working on a global compact for migration, and therefore the global dimension of migration should be prioritized over and above perhaps other dimensions, be they national or regional of migration, but they're also important. We are facing major challenges, namely that we have to come up with a document which is credible and which serves migrants regardless of from whence they hail or regardless of under whose government they fall. But the governments are, of course, primarily responsible for migratory policy. This global government has to reflect realities and provide the tools necessary to reflect and deal with migratory realities. Of course, there is the need to tackle the root causes of migration. And this needs to be adequately reflected in the pact. And if it isn't, we will not have shouldered the responsibility which we are asked to shoulder. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the speakers list is Austria. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Austria aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. In my national capacity, I would like to underline 4 priority areas in the global dimension. First, we need stronger and more effective multilateralism, including better cooperation between countries of origin, transit, and destination. Secondly, and that has been mentioned by many delegations, we need to address the drivers of irregular migration. Third point, we need to strengthen international measures to combat smuggling of migrants and trafficking in human beings. And lastly, and that has also been underlined by a lot of delegations in the course of these 2 days, we need improved data collection, in particular disaggregated data. Thank you.
Thank you. Next one is Turkey, followed by Senegal and Finland. Turkey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Under the global dimension of the GCM, we'd like to highlight 3 things. Number 1 is a principle. The GCM should underpin the basic premise that we have a shared responsibility to protect the lives of the people on the move, as well as to generate better opportunities and ensure a safe future to them and the next generations. Number 2 is about the UN system. We feel the GCM provides the opportunity for strengthening international cooperation among all stakeholders, and enhancing the capabilities within the UN system would be a concrete step that GCM would be bringing forward. And while referring to the UN system here, we are referring to the IOM as a related organization and the World Bank Group and other international financial institutions. Number 3, Mr. Moderator, is the important balance between the security and other dimensions of the migration. There's no doubt that in the existing state-led international system, questions of entry, stay and return remain within the sovereign discretion of states. However, international migration architecture, particularly any aspect concerning the governance of migration and matters of cooperation on transit and entry at the borders, has to reflect the ongoing realities. Our approaches to migration governance, particularly border management, cannot be solely determined based on a narrow viewpoint on security. In an era where we are experiencing an unprecedented level of human mobility, establishing this balance is no doubt very difficult, but through the GCM, it is also very much necessary. We believe through the Global Compact, creating an atmosphere of trust between countries, as well as closer and meaningful cooperation, will enable us to bridge that gap and the balance between the security and other dimensions of the migration at the global level. Thank you.
Thank you, Turkey. Now Senegal, followed by Finland. Senegal, please, the floor is yours.
Merci.
Many thanks to the co-facilitators and the moderator. Within these discussions, I'd just like to focus on the crux of the matter, that is the root causes of migration and a number of measures to tackle them. First of all, we need to use all domestic and internal measures we have, and we need to work together, namely through international cooperation, to foster new perceptions of migrations. We need to cast aside the notion of always needing to repress migration based on the rejection of the other. We also need to reject the principle of refoulement. Through this new vision, and its new vision, the GCM will commit to being a vector and indeed a receptacle which will prioritize the human dimension of the migratory phenomenon and will look at the notion of mutual interests in terms of migrants, because migrants can contribute to the economy, for example, of the states to where they go. Now, governance migration and strengthening it will involve effectively promoting the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers and the members of their families. This is a convention which was met favourably by many countries in the world and relates to a number of ILO documents on migrants. They're closely harmonised. In the Global Compact, space should be devoted to the establishment of public policies. Senegal focuses on public policies in migration indeed, and there needs to be better attention given in the pact to migration and its connection with the development of environment policies, urban planning policies, human mobility, foreign direct investment policies, tax policies, industrialization and employment. These are all issues linked to migration, and the pact needs to take that into account. We in this connection point to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, the Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2063. We as a country have committed to promoting the 3S initiative on sustainability, stability and security. This is an African initiative which has been designed to promote the creation of 2 million green jobs, green and decent jobs indeed, thanks to restoring 10 million hectares of degraded land, particularly in areas from which migrants depart, countries of origin. My fifth point, we need to reflect upon how we can promote the Global Compact becoming legally binding to a certain extent, perhaps, and we perhaps need to design mechanisms which would avoid us once again seeing us having an instrument giving rise to such hope but becoming ultimately dead letter, which is simply one which extols virtues of doing X, Y and Z but doesn't actually do anything in practice. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you also for reminding us the need to find mutual interests. I now have Finland and Sri Lanka, United Kingdom on the and then United Nations Major Group on Children and Youth. So Finland, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Finland fully aligns itself with the EU comments, but would like to make a couple of points in our national capacity. Human rights and gender should be mainstreamed throughout the Global Compact, and particular attention should be given to people in vulnerable situations, particularly people with disabilities. And I do agree with, for example, UN Women, that women are not inherently vulnerable, but in the process of migration, they do face vulnerabilities, abuse, and exploitation. Decision to migrate is always a personal decision, but there are different reasons, versatile reasons behind that, and we should address also those reasons, particularly reasons for illegal migration, be they political, economic, environmental, social, or others. And this happens through cooperation and partnerships. And one of the things is that the implementation of Agenda 2030 really addresses many of the root causes behind irregular migration. Enhancing legal pathways in forms of jobs and education opportunities gives people also choices and opportunities to go or to stay. Although we deal with regional, global, national, sub-regional dimension in different rooms, here I would like to point out that the regional consultative processes in all continents have already dealt with these issues, so we don't have to start from zero. And the last point is that this process, the global migration process and the compact needs a review mechanism, and I would also say that the IOM has a central role in that, but it's a whole of the UN process also, and should be carefully coordinated within the UN system and had coherence within the system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for reminding us of the work carried out by the regional consultative processes. Now, Sri Lanka is the next on the speakers list. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to share a few points here. First, monitoring of universal health coverage and advocate at the diplomatic level about the importance of migrant workers' health as a fundamental universal human right. Second, implement the guidelines developed by the Global Migration Group, GMG, on protection of migrants in vulnerable situations. Third, encourage countries of destination to ratify the international conventions on the protection of the rights of all migrant workers and members of their families, that is ICRMW, and other relevant labor migration conventions. Fourth, support countries for full implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in order to improve the living condition of people and reduce poverty, climate change, conflict, and disaster-driven migration. Finally, promote international responsibility in sharing information related to labor mobility. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the speakers list is the United Kingdom. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. First, I would like to align the United Kingdom with the statement made by the European Union. The UK believes that the unmanaged nature of much of today's global migration is failing both migrants themselves and individual states. The current approach is undermining public confidence in the ability of states to look after and manage their borders. The GCM presents us with an opportunity to tackle these problems and demonstrate that we are taking the current challenges seriously. We believe that if we are to meet the goal of orderly, safe and responsible migration, all states must address root causes, as others have mentioned. States should also commit to full implementation of the existing legal frameworks that protect fundamental human rights for their own citizens and for migrants. We should avoid adopting new frameworks or governance structures that will add further bureaucracy to an already complex process. On follow-up mechanisms, we agree with Australia that the focus should be on voluntary commitments and assisting states to achieve them, rather than monitoring and reviewing. Two issues have been raised in the hall that I'd like to speak to: legal pathways and regularization. Legal pathways can be effective tools for states to address skills gaps and labour market shortages, offering clear economic benefits to countries and migrants. So they can form part of a response to irregular migration, but they are not the whole solution, as there will never be sufficient legal pathways to meet demand. It is important that GCM recognises this, and that legal pathways can only work well if functioning and effective returns agreements are in place. On regularisation of irregular migrants, the UK believes that while states retain the sovereign right to determine the legal pathways into their countries, it is the responsibility of the migrant to ensure that they comply with the immigration laws of the host country. Furthermore, we are concerned that blanket regularisation could be a pull factor and may encourage people to take dangerous journeys and all that entails. Finally, we are currently living through a technological revolution, and we need to think about how to harness it to support safe, regular migration. Data is one area. There may be others. It could also be used, for example, for better registration of citizens and in building biometric databases to ensure identity and nationality can be determined internationally. Thank you.
Thank you. I have two more on my speakers list. The first one would be Intercultural Dialogue for Active Mexico, followed by United Nations Major Group on Children and Youth. So, Intercultural Dialogue for Active Mexico, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Intercultural Dialogue for an Active Mexico is the NGO that implements Havesha Project, a humanitarian initiative which purpose is to make it possible for Syrian students to finish higher education in Mexico. This initiative complements the limited but existing international initiatives that demonstrate a link between support for higher education and sustainably rebuilding communities affected by armed conflict. Over 600 million of youth live in conflict settings, and they also represent 50% of the total migrant population. Despite all the significant diplomatical efforts aimed at placing education as a core element of humanitarian response during crisis, much of the energy and resources have been directly towards basic education. And evidence of this is that only 1% of the refugee youth have access to higher education. Fortunately, the world already counts with a small number of higher education programs, such as the Albert Einstein program in Germany and the Global Platform for Syrian Students in Portugal. In Mexico, Havesha Project has proven the capacity of every country to contribute to the education of those who will have the responsibility to rebuild their communities once peace has been restored, no matter distance, language, or cultural differences. Based on alliances, these programs represent a very low cost that can be met without adding new burdens to the elevated budgets of humanitarian operations, and it opens the way to developing countries to be part of the response to humanitarian crisis. The GCM has enormous challenges to face. However, tackling the plight of the youth willing and able to get higher education poses no point of friction and offers long-lasting positive impacts. Therefore, United Nations member states must uphold their commitments made on point 82 on the New York Declaration regarding higher education in the final Global Compact for Migration. They must commit to creative strategies aimed at offering comprehensive mechanisms for guaranteeing higher education to youth affected by conflict. They must recognize and support the role of NGOs in the development and implementation of higher education emergency programs. And while developing these programs, they must include an intercultural dialogue orientations that promote resilience, justice, and peace in post-conflict conflicts and their societies. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the final speaker, United Nations Group on Children and Youth. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking on behalf of the United Nations Major Group on Children and Youth and Migrate Mexico as their regional focal point on migration. And I would like to share the views on the global dimension of migration of more than 5,000 organizations and individuals that are part of the MGCY. And this, I will address this in 3 points. The first one is to have local solutions, but based in universal principles. We know that the GCM should encourage links between human rights to legislation and regional policy. The second point is to support an international cooperation for the follow-up and review of the GCM. We think that the GCM should promote the development of an accountability framework with well-established metrics to measure the implementation of the GMC itself. And we think this process should formally fit into the high-level political forum on sustainable development. And last but not least, we think on this point that DESA and the IOM should produce an annual report on the state of implementation of the GCM. Last, the final point, we think that it's necessary to create a robust knowledge base about migration to enhance the science policy interface, because data is imperative in designing migratory policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have no further requests for the floor. I would like to thank you all for a very active participation and very concrete proposals. I have noted a few things that I wanted to say before ending this. I mean, there's been requests to enhance international cooperation and governance on migration. There's the centralism of the whole of UN approach, where IOM has been highlighted as a central player. There has also been repeated remarks on respecting national sovereignty, including emphasis, with a few exceptions, on the non-legally binding nature of the GCM. It's also been stated the need to base GCM on human rights and gender equality, and also the improvement of data. Of course, it's not my role to do the reporting on this. That is the role of my colleague here. Before concluding, I will remind participants that the reporting segment will take place tomorrow morning, immediately following brief opening remarks by the co-facilitators, beginning at 10 a.m. in this hall. Action Group 6 is now concluded. I would like to thank the interpreters for their job. There's a small practical announcement also, so please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I have a short announcement concerning transportation. The buses to the various hotels will be leaving following the conclusion of this meeting, and the same schedule will be followed for tomorrow. Thank you.